Hi everybody, my name is Larsen. When we play jazz guitar, we're using triads all the time, both in comping and in soloing. And usually the categories we work with will be major, minor, diminished, augmented and sus4 triads. But actually there's one more category of triads that we don't really have a name for it, but we use it all the time, and it might actually make sense to just think of it like that, because then we have a structure that we can add both to our comping and to our solos. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. If you want to know more about jazz guitar, about improvising over chord changes and finding interesting arpeggios and scales, then subscribe to my channel. If you want to make sure not to miss anything, then click the little bell notification icon next to the subscribe button. Just to illustrate how often we actually use this triad, I'm just going to play two cadences so you can see where you might come across it. In the first of the two cadences that I just played, I'm using the triad that I want to talk about on the C minor 6. So the voicing I'm playing is this, and the way we could look at this is also that it's an E flat, so an E flat major triad in the second inversion with a flat 5. And in the second cadence I'm using it on the G7, and that's this voicing, and the way to see that is probably as a B triad with a flat 5 again. So since we don't really have a name for this, I'm just going to call it, in this case, like a B major flat 5 triad. And in Dutch you have a name for them, they're called hard verminderd. But as far as I know, there's not a name for it in, well, Danish or English. So if you know of a name actually in any language, then leave a comment. I'm just curious if there's really no place where there's a name for this besides Holland, because it is a fairly common structure and you will see it, and also you probably play this all the time and this as well. So we use it so much that it's kind of strange that it doesn't have actually a category of its own. First I'm going to talk about how you can use these structures in your comping as chord voicings, and then I'm going to start later in this video to talk about how you can use them as arpeggios in your solos. So the first thing to start with, if you want to use them as chords, is probably just to check them out in inversions. So I'm going to do that for the two top set of strings with a C major flat 5 triad. And so that's going to be first on the G, B and E string, and then on the D, G and B strings. That would sound like this. The thing that we now need to look at is where can we actually use this triad as a voicing. So there are of course several ways to do that. Essentially you can just take the chord and then go through different root notes and see which ones you think sound good, and then sort of figure out what chords they are. I'm not really going to do that in the video. Instead I'm just going to go over some of the places where I use this triad really a lot. One of the first ones would be the minor 6 version, so in this case that would be an A minor 6. I'm also using it quite a lot as a D9 triad, and it works really well as a sort of A flat altered sound, and you can also use it as sort of a Phrygian B7 sus4 with a flat 9 type sound, and on occasion you can also get away with using it as an F sharp half diminished. So in this example I'm using the C major flat 5 triad as an A minor 6 voicing, and I'm just playing a cadence before, so this is a B half diminished. It's basically a D minor triad, which I'm using, and then we get this E7 with a flat 9, and then resolving that to the A minor. An example of using it as a D9 would be something like this. And we can of course also use it as an A flat 7 altered voicing. So here I'm using this second inversion C flat 5 triad as the top part of an A flat 7 with a flat 13, and resolving that to this rootless D flat major 7. I think there's a good chance that you probably already know some of the examples that I just went over using the major flat 5 triad. And I think the way you want to think about this is also then that if you start working with the inversions of the major flat 5, you might come across things that you don't already know, and you might be able to quite easily add something to your vocabulary in terms of comping. And the same of course goes for soloing. So if we want to use the major flat 5 triad for soloing, we need to figure out how to first just play the arpeggio. I think there are sort of two ways that I would suggest you try and play it in a position if you want to play it from C here. So the first one will be this one. Because here I'm using that it's really just 3 notes and we can just move it up in octaves. And the other one would be to play it more in a position, that could be something like this. And of course you should just use your own fingerings as a starting point to figure out some major flat 5 arpeggios, because that way you're probably gonna be closer to ending up with something that you already play, and you don't have to check out the ones that I'm using exactly. In this example, I'm using the C major flat 5 triad as a part of a C7 altered line. I'm using it in the melodic minor context because of course C7 altered is the same as D flat melodic minor, so we have this scale. And there are 3 places where you have a major flat 5 triad in a melodic minor, because you have one on C, and you have one on E, and one on G flat. But in this example, I'm just using the one on C just to keep it a bit simple. The first part of the line is just on the G minor, so that's just a B flat major triad and a scale one. Then I play the C major flat 5 triad, kind of echoing the idea on the B flat, skipping up to the root, and then a small scale one. Here I'm using the major flat 5 triad as it is found in a diminished scale, because of course if we have the diminished scale that we associate with C7, then that will be this scale. And actually we have the C major flat 5 triad, and that means that we actually have all 4 of them. So we'll have one for A, C, E flat, and G flat. So you can use those, and that's what I'm doing here in the line. The first part of the line is again on the G minor, just starting with a B flat major triad, so in this pattern, skipping up to the G, and then a scale one. And then on the C7, I start with the flat 5 and play the descending major flat 5 triad. Then I just play that same idea, but then from A, so I start on the E flat, so E flat, C sharp, and then A, and then I use the C and the B flat to resolve to the third of F, which is an A. In this final example, I'm using the C major flat 5 triad on an A minor 6, because when we can use it as a voicing, we can of course also use it as an arpeggio when we're soloing. So the cadence is really fairly basic, so it's B half diminished, E7 to A minor 6, and I start with an F major 7 arpeggio on the B half diminished, and then down a sort of a scale run from A minor pentatonic, and on the E7 I go to the 5, and then from the D up to the F, skipping down to get a G sharp, and then back up to F, down to D, and then I'm resolving to the C on the A minor 6, and from here I'm playing the major flat 5 triad and then resolving that to the 9 on the A minor 6. With A minor 6, the scales we use is probably going to be A melodic minor, and the same as with the C7 also, we actually have 3 different major flat 5 triads that we can use in a melodic minor scale. So in the case of A melodic minor, that means that we have the one that we used, which is on the C, but there's another one on D, and then there's also one on G sharp. Since you're probably familiar with how this sounds as a chord voicing, you're probably going to have an easy time trying to add it into your playing, and you can check out some inversions to maybe get a few more options, and that can be very useful and also quite easy to implement. And I think you should try and do the same with the arpeggios, because again it is a distinct sound, but you can really use it in a lot of different places, and and like any triad really. And it's always nice to have these kind of strong melodies that triads really are. If you think about where you find them, so I already talked about the fact that you have them 3 places in melodic minor and 4 places in the diminished scale. But you might also want to check out that there's only 1 place in the major scale. Any scale that you use, start to look into where can I actually find this sound, and where can I try and use it. And it might be in some surprising places also, because one of the ones in melodic minor on the 7th degree is kind of obvious for altered chords, but in a lot of other contexts might be really useful for some new colors. If you want to learn more about jazz guitars, about superimposing pentatonic scales and interesting arpeggios and other scale choices, then subscribe to my channel. I publish a new lesson every week, and I've been doing it for quite some time, so there's already really a lot of material on my channel. One of the things that makes it possible for me to continue making all these videos is that I have a small community of people on Patreon that support me. And if you want to help me keep making all the videos, then check out my Patreon page and join that community. And of course, if you support me on Patreon, I can give you something in return for your support. That's about it for this week. Thank you for watching, and until next week.